Thanks very much, John. Laura, before we open up to questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick because I think that we've had a very wide spectrum of issues discussed by this great panel. I represent the European movement, and we are sort of a grassroots campaigning organisation and have done quite a lot of research. And I think what's amusing about the split of opinion, and it probably also reflects some of the business opinion, is north of Nottingham, Europe is considered as being a capitalist conspiracy. South of Nottingham, it's seen as a socialist plot. And between these two different perspectives, the debate has to be joined, and in many ways the conversation with both businesses, individuals, and John is quite right, this is the vote of the small business owner is the same as the chief executive of a global corporation. So it's very important, and I think the business voice is exceptionally important when it comes to, in many ways, the referendum coming up. Bureaucracies. Well, I'm a good Conservative, and what we need is less bureaucracies right across the board. But that includes also, John rightly talks about regulation. I would love us to do an assessment of the gold plating that Whitehall has done on EU legislation. If you start to actually impose, if we were imposing EU legislation at the middle level across other countries, I think that we would find ourselves repealing quite a lot of the secondary legislation and the regulation that we have. So I think that there's also a reform agenda in the UK that needs to be looked at to actually ensure that we deliver on your sort of regulation burden. But I think it's interesting when we start to look at some of the debates out there, which is about Brexit, etc. Quite rightly, Damien said that why is it so difficult for us to export around the world, which is this great opportunity that we're going to have day one of paradise when we come out of Europe, where we're going to be able to export around the world. When you start to look at the Germans, in Germany, they're exporting to countries that I would say the Foreign Office don't even know how to spell. And here we are wanting to trade 500 million customers for people that we don't even know want some of our goods. The point is, I'm ambitious for this country. We should want it all. Why do we need to lose customers off the back end to gain new customers on the front end? I've run a business. That would be madness. So what we need is greater ambition in this country and greater ambition for trade deals through the EU. The other issue that comes up a lot is the word Iceland. Wonderful. The UK can do its own trade deals. This is no problem whatsoever. And Iceland is this fantastic example. Well, Iceland did a deal with the US, absolutely fantastic. A free trade deal, which meant that every single good that's manufactured in the US can access the Icelandic market, and 4 products from Iceland can access the US market. So we've got to understand that we have a much, much greater power with our trade deals when we're working with a much, much bigger market. So I think that we've got to be really clear about setting that agenda within Europe and ensuring that we're more ambitious on trade. But we certainly will do better with Europe than without. Very quickly on the digital services and energy union, I think that we're talking about the services benefit, and I think it's actually much further down the line, John, than you were hinting, but would actually increase our GDP by 7%. Now, that is quite a huge amount of money, and also, in many ways, helps companies up and down the country, not just big centres of manufacturing. We also have to look at this from the perspective of small businesses. We all talk about, big foreign investment, big manufacturing. I used to represent an area that had some very, very attitudinal fishermen who I loved and who, on the whole, were not voting Conservative. They were not voting Labour. They were very taken by Nigel Farage. And then I asked them a question. So where do you sell your fish? And they said 90% of our fish we sell in Boulogne Fish Market. Well, all I can say is that French fishermen are even more attitudinal than British fishermen. And the idea that they were going to be able to access the Boulogne fish market without possibly not tariff barriers. But what is really important if we come out is the non-tariff barriers that will suddenly start to emerge. And I think that we've got to really ensure that that message is got across. My very last point is the day, as I say, day one in paradise, when we come out of Europe, when all our problems are solved. There is this very, very misrepresentation that we will be there sitting around the table negotiating our trade deal. From what I understand, the treaty says that the moment we come out, the trade deals and the relationship that we have in the future will be done by the countries that are in, and we will not be sitting around that table. And so I think it's very, very risky when people talk about us being able to negotiate the deals that we want and we need. Because, as somebody said to me, either you're at the table or you might find yourself on the menu. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. Plenty of food for thought, I'm sure you'll agree, from our panel members. I'm guessing there'll be quite a few questions. We've got about half an hour or thereabouts, 35 minutes to plough through as many questions as possible. So if we have a show of hands to who wants to ask. This lady at the back was first with her hand up.
Thank you.
If you can just introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name's Elizabeth Gibson. My name's Elizabeth Gibson. I come from Vauxhall in South London. I was intrigued listening to everyone, but even more so at the end of Laura, because she spoke about messages. And I hear so much from business how the positive case for staying in Europe, and I think we all agree. But when it comes to the crunch and the vote, excuse me, it's going to have simple messages that convince the electorate that they should vote yes. And things like the fisherman story is crucial. The fact that you might have a visa if you want to go to France on holiday. Rest assured, all those barriers would be set up because it's in the best interests of the countries to make money out of us leaving. And so I think when it comes to campaigning, we need 5 simple messages that spell out to everyone in our country just what it means if we did decide to leave the EU. And they need to be positive messages about staying in.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Damon, do you want to? How do you make a positive case for the EU? Obviously, the Scottish referendum last year was Project Fear, was the name given to the campaign to keep Scotland in the UK. How do you guard against that?
By doing both. I mean, people should be fearful of leaving the EU. It would be the most extraordinary risk this country has ever taken. But I take Liz's point absolutely. There are positive reasons. Both in terms of what we're discussing today, the sort of prosperity agenda, and the answer, I think, is actually to have real-life examples, and I know they're being prepared of companies that will be able to tell a story of how they've created jobs and prosperity from staying in. But, of course, apart from what we're discussing this morning, there is a whole other agenda of the strength of Britain's voice in the world. It's unarguable that Britain's capacity to influence world events is increased by our being members of the European Union. And the idea that America, let alone China or India, would take us more seriously, would listen to us more if we were outside, is a fantasy. And Obama has said that. He's made it perfectly clear. And in the Balance of Competences review, the Japanese government, for example, said they found it completely extraordinary that Britain was even considering leaving. So other countries around the world have that. So I think, to a Conservative audience, I think that's a particularly powerful thing. We all want Britain to play a significant role on the world stage. With all due respect to those other countries, we're not Switzerland and Norway. We have a different history. We have a global outlook. And being part of the European Union enables us to amplify our voice around the world. So there are, if you like, the more emotional arguments that can be made, not necessarily in the business sphere, but certainly in other parts of the campaign.
Kathy, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, just briefly, I think this is a exceptionally important question for Britain, and I think for the business community this is about providing information on the debate, and we see, certainly at the CBI, and I'm sure you're the same, John, our space is jobs and growth, so we're not going to have a view on every single aspect to do with EU membership, but we do care about jobs and growth, so that is very much going to be our focus, and I do agree with you that we need to find ways of making it real and really try and bring it down from a very kind of macro level, which can feel a bit theoretical, to talking about what the impact would be for individual companies and for employees working for those companies.
Laura,
I mean,
response?
just to say, on the business side, I think we've got to talk about small businesses. And actually, when you start to look at whether Nissan stays or goes, it's actually the guy who makes the sandwiches for the Nissan factory. He's not coming or going. It's not it's not the large companies have actually got choices about where they locate, how they invest, etc. It is the supply chain that matters. And I would love somebody to do a little video which is called The Day in the Life of a Widget, and take that widget from a very small operation in Loughborough into a car that's then sold in Spain.
This gentleman here.
I'm Abdul Mateen. I'm from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. We heard a lot of common sense, and Damon Green spoke about common sense, and Laura spoke about us not being a part of the round table if we come out of Europe. That is common sense. And Katia spoke about saving money. When I went to Strasbourg, when I went to Brussels, European members of European Parliament came to me and said, we are devastated with the cost involved of moving from Brussels to Strasbourg, Strasbourg to Brussels. Can you please do something about it? This ritual is such an ongoing ritual. I was wondering if the panel can explain, is this ritual sustainable? Thank you.
I think it's safe to say the EU has a few imperfections. Damien, do you want to?
No, I completely agree. I mean, it's of course completely indefensible. One of the dafter ideas that was produced, as you all know, our own Parliament building is crumbling, and we are being threatened with moving out of it. And I see people are proposing that as a way of getting Parliament out to the people, we should move the British Parliament around the country, to which you say, hang on, we've all spent 30 years moaning about the European Parliament decamping to another place at vast expense. Let's not repeat that mistake here. But no, I mean, I don't know anyone, so at least all MEPs, I don't know any MEPs in the room that actually defend this idea. It's a sort of hangover from when the EU was set up, and the French insisting on having it in Strasbourg. But no, it's madness. And Edward, you'll probably have to defend this, don't you, more than anyone else? None of us else is paid by the EU.
I think you'll understand I'm very... as a Commission official, I'm very reticent to comment on the fact that I have my own views, but...
a very sensible choice, I think. This gentleman with the beard at the back.
Excuse me. Phil Clark, Orpington. A lot of the argument I'm hearing seems to be about fear of access or inability to access the single market and the threat of tariff barriers coming up. Is it true, though, that the EU is such a vindictive organisation that would seek to punish us? And therefore, my question is this. I have a German car. Should I sell it now? Because when the UK government jacks up retaliatory tariffs, will my car become unaffordable? And as a sub-question, does the CBI still want us to join the Eurozone?
That is a big question indeed. Katia, do you want to answer that?
On your second question, no. On your first question, so it's a good question, and the honest answer is, of course, we don't quite know what an agreement would look like for the UK outside the EU. I'm sure we will have one, we will get one. I don't think it would be about the EU being vindictive. I think it's about, if you don't want to be part of the club and pay the membership fee, in a sense, for that club, that you're not going to get the same level of benefits. So who knows? I mean, I think the WTO tariff on cars is 10%. Jeans from the US cost £5 to £10 more than jeans from Europe. So, it will. We just don't quite know, but it will likely to lead to more expensive goods for shoppers in the UK.
Laura, why would the EU be...
I mean, I think it's something quite really, really interesting, because it's a sort of almost where we've got to ourselves as a country, sort of psychologically. And that is that when I go to UKIP rallies, and it's all quite interesting. I almost come out alive. But the point with it is, at this moment, the narrative is that we're a victim of Europe, right? We're a victim of foreigners telling us what to do, of controlling all our lives, that we have no say, we have no influence. The day that we vote to come out, we're suddenly an unbelievably strong country with the absolute desirability that everybody will bend over backwards to help us. And it is an extraordinary sort of psychological contradiction of where we actually are. I mean, the point is, we are very influential already, and we will get some form of deal. The point is that deal will not be defined by us. It will be something that we will be given. And so we've got to be very, very clear about what that actually looks like. The other issue is Norway is interesting. The large companies in Norway, they've actually started buying companies in Sweden so that they can sit round the table when it comes round to setting standards, single market regulations, etc. So in many ways, what ends up happening is that countries who are out of the EU want to have a say in the EU and are finding different ways of doing it. So the idea that we want to come out ourselves seems a little bit counterproductive.
And on the Norwegian point, of course, they have to pay.
Yes.
Norwegians buy access to the European single market.
10th,
and Norway is the 10th biggest contributor. Net contributor to the EU budget, without having any power to set any of the rules. So, I think the tariff barriers will be disadvantages, but it is the more subtle non-tariff barriers that if you want to sell washing machines to Germany and all the safety regulations for washing machines, you as a British manufacturer have had no input into them. You know what? Common sense suggests they're probably not going to be made to fit your washing machines, as opposed to the washing machines of those who are inside the club. And that's why free trade deals and rules are so important. And I mean, the other point to make is that it is easier for a group of 500 million people to look China and look America in the eye and say, right, we're now going to do a fair trade deal with you, than it would be for a country of 65 million. There is some safety in numbers.
John, I mean, your survey would indicate that there's a lot of votes in play amongst that community. Is this a consideration? Is this something that the people you're speaking to are concerned about? Should Britain leave?
The votes in play in the business community are concerned with the reform agenda. I must sort of presage every comment I make on this panel with that fact, that actually it's the reform agenda that our business community are particularly interested in. And one of the reasons why it's hugely important that we don't fear for the various things that are being said on the panel is that we're not able to make a tough negotiating position on a reform agenda unless we have the courage of our convictions. And believe me, reform is hugely important, not just for the UK, but for the EU as a whole. Because right now, the EU is an economic basket case and is not likely to improve much in the foreseeable future. And if we're actually going to be prosperous as a European Union, we need to get economic liberal reform. Liberal with a small L, I'm talking about now, particularly in this context of this conference. Just to put some of the facts straight, though, it's important to get the facts straight in order that we do have the courage of our convictions in terms of negotiation. 2 years ago, Britain was Germany's #1 export market. Last year we were the #3 export market, but only by a very narrow margin. Actually higher than China and the United States. It's highly unlikely, in my opinion, that if the UK were to leave the EU, that Germany would decide to wipe out a huge export market by introducing tariffs when there might be counter-tariffs introduced by the UK. The second point, just to point out, in terms of putting the facts straight, Britain has a balance of trade surplus in services, which is our biggest sector by far, with the United States, which is 7 times bigger than the positive balance of trade in services with the EU. And yet we have no free trade agreement with the United States. It's curious that we're actually in a free trade area which performs less well than a market in which we have no free trade area. The reason for this, of course, is that there is no free trade services. There's no appetite for any free trade in services, and that's the official policy, official position of the Directorate Generals and Secretariat Generals of the EU, because I've heard it from the horse's mouth. The third fact that I think is important to recognise, because I actually wrote to the Trade Director General on this question, is if the UK were to leave the EU, the trade deals that the EU have on our behalf with third countries would be whether those trade deals would continue, whether we would continue to benefit from those trade deals, would be entirely a matter for the third country, not for the EU. And I cannot imagine that South Korea would want to stop trading with the UK as a consequence of us leaving the EU. These are the sort of facts that it's important to recognise. The highest tariffs that are available to the EU to apply are actually in the automobile sector, so it's very important to us. It's 13% on parts and 9% on automobiles themselves. Every other sector of the UK economy that has tariffs applied is lower than that. The other big area being chemicals, which is just above 5%. Now, it's worth remembering that fluctuations in currency over the last 2 years have actually exceeded those percentages at any one time, and that has not in itself prevented us trading with the world. So all I'm saying with these facts is I'm not advocating that it's a good idea to leave the EU. On the contrary, our business community wants to stay in it. But it is extraordinarily important not to be fearful about negotiating a good reform package with the EU. Because if we don't have a good reform package, my concern is that we'll end up in a situation where, because the UK fears the consequences of leaving, that we will in fact vote to stay within the EU. That's my belief, that we will. But that we'll end up having to do it all again 5 to 10 years later, because if we don't get the reform package and the UK is politically and economically damaged and marginalised by the Eurozone, which will increasingly become to look like a country, it will have to survive, then we'll end up with a vote at that point, which is a stark choice of joining the Eurozone or leaving, at a point at which it will be much more damaging for the UK to make that decision. So it's very important that the Prime Minister has the full support of the business community in his reform negotiations for the sake of the UK and for the sake of the future of the European Union.
Thanks, John. I'm most anxious to get as many questions. I mean, I can understand why why your discussion is going down the referendum route, but if we can maybe try and keep it to as best we can anyway to the topic that we're here to discuss. This gentleman at the back here.
I ran a very small business which had no customers in the United Kingdom at all, and I used to visit Europe frequently. My disappointment this morning is that nobody's actually mentioned the catastrophic events which have happened very recently with regard to the refugees coming in from all over the place. If it was a cohesive, well-governed government, they would definitely have been acted better. What it has cost the EU and what it will cost the EU, I dread to think, and we shall pick up the bill. Now, I'm actually very pro-market, but to have a man who was the Prime Minister of one of the smallest members of the EU, as the boss, with one of the German commissioners having 3 cars and an office of 35, I suggest also in our negotiations we look very firmly at the governments of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, did the refugee crisis, I'm not sure that the EU...
I think the refugee crisis is an absolute human disaster and is absolutely dreadful. I can't say that it's the EU's fault that the refugee crisis happened. I actually worked on it on the Iraq War. I worked for military intelligence during that war, and I think that you can trace a lot of these problems to our intervention and ill-conceived post-conflict preparation right across the Middle East. However, I would say, and I will be critical of the EU, is for the last 10 to 15 years there have been huge amount of reports, academic reports, saying that migration is going to be an issue. Forget the Syrian conflict. And there has been no preparation, not in this country, not in Europe, and this is something that has been predicted for a very, very long time. So in many ways, why wasn't Europe and the Schengen area prepared? Why did they not have understanding of how to deal with these migration flows that all happen seasonally? And I think that we need to take this extremely seriously and ensure that we're investing in those countries, giving hope, optimism and prosperity that we have in Europe around the world, to ensure that we can actually ensure these people want to stay in their countries. They don't want to be travelling across in dinghies. So I think we've got something to look at ourselves, and I agree with you. We didn't do it well enough, and we need to do it much, much better.
Any other questions? Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much. Earlier on, you were talking. Thanks very much, Gordon McCann from Wire. Earlier on, you were talking about the fact that if we came out of the EU, then there would be tariff barriers that would actually be erected. That's the way you saw it. Yet later on, you started talking about TTIP, which was a free trade area across the Atlantic. Now, if the EU and America and we are a member of TTIP, how would that play with the EU erecting tariff barriers against Great Britain?
Just to be clear, I wasn't speculating on any hypothetical scenario for the future. I was trying to set out the agenda of the Commission as it stands now, and I'm going to resist the temptation to go down that. But on the specific question of TTIP, yes, this is indeed one of the 10 priorities that this Commission has identified. We've come a long way down the track in negotiations. This is an extremely wide-ranging and ambitious deal, which would have enormous, we believe, positive economic benefits to the UK and all other EU member states. Negotiations are progressing. As I've said, the Americans have just concluded their big trade deal with their Pacific partners, which I think now allows them to focus a bit more on this one. And so we hope to make accelerated progress in the future. But, all I can say is that we continue to prioritise that. We see it as extremely important for our jobs and growth and investment agenda. But the hypothetical scenario is not one that I've speculated on and want to do so now. So.
David?
Well, actually, look at it from the Americans' point of view. They're negotiating what is a big, complex, sensitive deal for them, as it is for Europe. If halfway through these big, sensitive negotiations, we Britain said, by the way, don't include us out of that, we're no longer part of that, can we go alongside and organise a separate deal for ourselves? I think, at best, the Americans would heave an exasperated sigh and think, what are the Brits up to? It's quite a practical example of what it would do to our reputation in the world. It certainly wouldn't enhance it.
Thanks, Stephen. This gentleman, and then I'll come to you next.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Large. I'm the Chief Executive of a trade association in the poultry meat sector. I'd like to come back to the sort of investment plan for Europe, which is the sort of the handouts that we were given on the chairs this morning. Looking through the papers here, it's clear that it's very much aimed at some fairly large-scale, fairly ambitious exercises. And I guess I'd like the panel's view. Given the bureaucracy and the administrative hurdles about securing and then engaging with the European Union when it comes to taking funding from it, the extent to which grand plans like this are better or worse than sort of micro-scale incremental initiatives that actually help to boost the competitiveness of individual businesses at a very, very micro level in the economy, rather than these great overarching, strategic, possibly white elephants.